Viewpoints on the talk station FM 107, AM 1240. We've been watching with interest the continuing dispute about hourly wages and, in fact, the recent threat of boycotts and, yes, even violence on the part of fast food workers, apparently attempting or thinking of planning to unionize. And I find that interesting in light of the fact that many of them have part-time, these are part-time jobs, or for that matter, they're temporary jobs on to the next big opportunity. And yet, in the midst of all of this, we're looking at a conflict with management and, of course, growing profits. Well, in some instances, growing profits. But the other aspect of this, and one that I find interesting, is the role that the federal government is pretending to play or planning to play. And I think it's pretending more than planning, but we'll find out from our guest this afternoon, Professor Adam Smith. He's the Assistant Professor of Economics and Director of the Center for Free Market Studies at Johnson & Wales University in Charlotte, North Carolina. We've had him on in the past. And with that, Professor, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Lockwood. Thanks for having me.
Before we get into this issue of the possibility of fast food workers getting higher pay and possibly unionizing and organizing, let's really quickly talk about Johnson & Wales, the university there in Charlotte. And by the way, there is an interesting connection to this. And of course, Johnson & Wales, known for its work in food services and, you know, the fact that it has a professor of economics there. Very interesting. Let's talk about that for a moment.
Oh, sure. I mean, this is an issue that very much affects the industries that our students are currently working in, have worked for, and will work for. We're obviously trying to put out graduates that are likely to make much more than the minimum wage. We wouldn't be doing our jobs if that wasn't the case. But nevertheless, these sort of issues will certainly affect the kind of environments, kind of work environments that they will be in.
We've discussed this in the past with some of our millennials. As a matter of fact, they'll be following up this program, and I'm sure this topic will probably come up during their program in the next hour. And that, of course, has to do with the compensation of fast food workers and the fact that they are contending that there's need for greater pay and that the industry needs to be more sensitive. Yet it's an industry that, for all intents and purposes, has never been a high on the, pardon the expression, food chain when it comes to paying employees, because the vast majority of the jobs are what I would qualify as temporary. I've never seen or considered a fast food restaurant as a profession. So let's go to this issue. I see that, as a matter of fact, read with interest recently, and you're responding to it. The McDonald's Corporation, McDonald's CEO, is actually supporting the raising the federal minimum wage from $7.25 to $10.10, which, by the way, is less than the requested raise by those fast food workers and by others being bandied about, and that's $15 an hour. But what about this issue on the part of McDonald's? How valid is this, and what's your observation about the McDonald's CEO suggesting that a federal minimum wage be raised to $10.10? I have several thoughts on this, but yours first, please.
Well, Lockwood, you said a lot of things there. A lot of thoughts came to mind. Let me share just a few facts before going into the McDonald's angle that I think your listeners will be interested in. First, only about 3% of the workforce is paid the minimum wage.
Oh, really?
And of that, less than 0.5% are heads of households. So this is not an issue that usually affects, again, like you were commenting on, career-minded individuals, or at least not at any kind of peak of their career. This is, as you say, this is where people sort of start off. So another thing to consider is around 60% of people who earn the minimum wage earn more than that within a year, right? So again, this is very much a very small part of the overall labor force, and one that's on the rise, not one that's stuck, I guess, at that minimum wage. Thinking about the McDonald's thing, it's really interesting because you've got this response that seems, very humanitarian, right? You've got a major CEO who has to deal with all kinds of payroll, labor costs, production cost consideration, and he's saying, workers should have more. So on the one hand, we sort of feel like that's a good thing. That's something that he seems to be very interested in his workers and so forth. But I think we should immediately be skeptical because, first off, why now?
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't this come to him years ago, right? Why didn't it come to other people years ago? Maybe there's something else behind it. And so in the piece that I wrote that went into Investors Business Daily, what I decided was that McDonald's has an angle that most of their competitors do not, and that is that they use more machines than people. And so when the minimum wage goes up, it affects other places like Five Guys, who use a lot of people in the restaurants, much more than McDonald's, which uses more, again, equipment, capital, and so forth. So higher labor costs for their competitors, more so than them.
Right. Taking the opportunity to regulate their competition, if you will, out of business or into a position of weakness for all intents and purposes.
That's it.
Associated with this, and we get into this issue of government establishing a value for a job and a workforce. And of course, I might add, we're talking about this today with the announcement that we've seen a big run-up in the gross domestic product, the GDP, almost 4%, higher than anticipated, not 4% higher, but 4%, which is higher than was originally anticipated or predicted. We're seeing new employment numbers improving significantly, unemployment down. Of course, we can get into this without consideration, though, of those that have given up looking for jobs. But in the midst of all of this is the effort to standardize a payroll and or a value to a company. And of course, here, McDonald's, by the way, I'm wondering if McDonald's is so much in favor of raising the minimum wage to $10.10. Has McDonald's already done that as sort of an example to set the standard, or are they waiting for federal government to dictate that? What do you know about that proposal from McDonald's?
Well, McDonald's does tend to pay their workers a little more than the minimum wage. Again, I go back to this claim that McDonald's is utilizing way more machines than their competitors, so they can afford a little bit of that premium on their labor. If you've got another company that's using more kind of made-to-order food and sort of customized food, that's, let's call it kind of fast food plus, again, you're going to need lots of people in the kitchen, lots of workers, not as much that's just mass-produced outside of the actual location. So again, the labor costs are a much bigger part of your concerns, right, of your overall production costs than it would be McDonald's.
But the other aspect, I still want to go back to this. Here McDonald's is suggesting that the federal government dictate $10.10 an hour for minimum wage. And I've got to get into this issue of the minimum wage here in a moment. I still have to say, it would seem to me that McDonald's would announce our starting pay for all workers at McDonald's is $10.10. And we would ask that others in the industry, particularly, quote, fast food, close quote. We'll get into the other aspects of restaurateuring here in a few moments with our guest, Professor Adam Smith, Professor of Economics at and the Director of the Center for Free Market Studies at Johnson & Wales University in Charlotte. I want to get into the other aspects of food service here in a few moments. But, Professor, it just seems to me that it smacks hypocrisy when McDonald's is saying to the federal government, you set the standard. The other problem I have with this, your observation on this, please, is why would anyone in the private sector ask for a third party to establish a value on a worker for that company? McDonald's will set that value. They should. I would, as a owner of stock in McDonald's, I would want my company to establish those values. I don't want somebody from the steel industry or, for that matter, the federal government establishing that value. I want to establish that value. So again, I don't get this when the CEO is suggesting the federal government should do it. Why doesn't just, if you want the fast food enterprise, make that a standard to become a blue chip member of the fast food industry, that sort of thing. That's what I don't understand.
Right. Well, I think you understand it very well because obviously you're implying exactly what's going on in all those great points there. So, why doesn't the place do it just for themselves?
Right.
Why regulate everyone else? This is an old game that big companies have been playing for a long time. Take tobacco, for example. There's all kinds of regulation with tobacco. And one of the things that actually really helps big tobacco is when they get laws passed that eliminate advertising. So you're a big tobacco company like R.J. Reynolds, for example, right?
Yeah.
If you can ban advertising,
yes.
well, your cigarettes will always be well known. That brand's been established.
Right.
But what about new brands? right? They're going to have a really hard time competing because they have no way of advertising. So it's one of those things where it sounds like it's for a good cause, but you're just trying to undermine your competitor.
You're undermining your competitors, but in the long term, you're feeding a devil. And literally, I'm calling government a devil here. And eventually, it's going to come back and bite the likes of McDonald's. You know, that's a good point related to the cigarette industry here for a moment. McDonald's also. You have longevity. You have, as you said, strong brand identity and recognition. And in the case of any kind of retail product, such as cigarettes, one of the things that every manufacturer and wholesaler is looking for retail space. That is shelf space. And a large corporation, a food chain, a fast food business, or convenience store business, they're going to always err, if you will, on the side of the well-known, the well-received product. So you're correct. If I'm producing new brand cigarettes and I want to get shelf space at a convenience store, I'm going to have to actually pay the convenience store to give me shelf space because they're not inclined to do it, because they would rather give shelf space to the recognized brands. Same holds true even in the fast food industry. Am I thinking correctly there?
Sure, yeah. Right on.
All right. We're going to get back to the subject in just a moment about the whole issue of minimum wage with our guest this afternoon, Professor Adam Smith, Professor of Economics and Director for the Center for Free Market Studies at Johnson & Wales University. And I applaud his comment and his observation, which is, well, quite frankly, pretty cynical about the efforts on the part of the CEO of McDonald's, all in favor of his employees, who apparently is waiting for the federal government to require him and the company to automatically initiate a 10.10 per hour minimum pay raise. Now, the argument might be, Professor, that they're just trying to deflect the potential of a $15 per hour minimum wage for the fast food industry. I want to get back to the role of the fast food industry in our economy in just a moment. Our guest again, Professor Adam Smith, Assistant Professor of Economics and Director of the Center for Free Market Studies at Johnson & Wales University in Charlotte, North Carolina. The professor has written an interesting piece recently about why McDonald's CEO supports raising the minimum wage. And your argument a few moments ago, Professor, is that this is an opportunity really to use federal regulation to put the competitors, especially the small competitors, at a disadvantage. That's your basic analysis on that?
Correct. Yes. I think it's something where they're trying to undermine competitors using the arm of the federal government. It's sort of an old game that big companies play.
The other aspect of this, and it's one of those issues where it becomes incrementalism. Okay, if we establish a minimum wage in one industry, or for that matter, across the board, it not only impacts just McDonald's, but it impacts other small businesses across the board. And it's interesting related to that, there are far more participants in small business than in large corporations. Does a company like McDonald's not realize the potential impact this could have on other small businesses unrelated to the food business?
I think they are aware of what it will do to the small businesses because they're thinking about the small businesses that they're competing with. Are they considering the labor expenditures of people across the country and what a federal regulated minimum wage would do? I mean, one would think, but obviously they're trying to get ahead using the federal government anyway.
Well, the argument has been posed by several of our millennials, as a matter of fact, here on the talk station, and they join us every Thursday evening in the second hour of the program, that the whole purpose of regulations is leveling the playing field. Yet it seems to me that in this environment where people are losing their jobs because the jobs have gone away. And by the way, that's the other aspect of this minimum wage increase. I know that, for example, Panera Bread has announced they're going to be reducing labor because they're going to more mechanical forms of order taking and delivery, robotics for all intents and purposes. Again, it's going to put more people out of business, particularly at the entry level. That's the other aspect of fast food business. Is it not a means, a ramp into the business market for people? Isn't this a key way for people to get experience in business?
Oh, absolutely. And I love that comment that, regulation is trying to make a level playing field. But here's the thing, it's not a level playing field now, right? You've got some companies that can absorb labor costs very well because they're, huge, and they're spreading those costs among tons and tons of locations and lots of quantity and output. And then you've got other companies that are smaller where labor's, again, a very large chunk of the budget. So now let's increase the price of labor. Well, if you do that, everyone has to substitute away from labor more towards machines. Which companies are going to be better at that? Obviously, the big ones.
Right.
And a lot of small companies, not only is it going to be difficult, it may be impossible. And so we see fewer companies that are doing the kind of custom-made stuff, at least in the restaurant industry, more of the made-to-order stuff, companies that are buying local, all these kinds of things. Raising the price of labor arbitrarily like that means we're going to be moving away from those models and more to a standardized, very large corporate model.
This brings me to the question of the value of minimum wage. And of course, I've always argued it's minimum wage is not necessarily a living wage. By the way, I want to go back to some statistics you read to us earlier in the program. 3%, and this, as I understand, is in the fast food industry, or is this across the country? I would assume
across the country.
3%? Did I hear that?
3% of the labor force makes minimum wage.
3% of the labor force makes minimum wage. And you said 1/2 of 1%? Is that correct?
1/2 of 1% are heads of households. So that's the other thing is, it's kind of like, think about the issue of foreign aid. You know how people think that like 20% of the government's budget goes to foreign aid and it's just insignificant. Same thing with the minimum wage. People think that, well, this is such a huge issue because it affects so many people. Well, not really. It only affects, again, about 3% of the people, and the vast majority of them are not heads of household. They're usually kids. They're usually students.
The other aspect of this, and okay, they are students. This is an entry-level job opportunity, or if you will, it's a temporary job opportunity as the employees look for other opportunities. If you raise the level of fast food, the cost, and you raise this minimum wage and you make it a very good living wage, then people are less inclined to really go out and, if you will, risk or push or raise the bar. It's almost as if government is now actually trying to lower the bar by stabilizing the employment environment out there so that there's no real incentive to discipline or sacrifice in order to move ahead in life. Is this not an opportunity or potential for basically drawing down our culture, our society, our very industry in the U.S.?
Well, I think it's actually, as cynical as that is, I think it's worse.
Oh, really?
It's worse than that. The major problem is not so much that people are going to be kind of given a wage on the silver platter. It's that they're not going to be given a wage, period. It's the unseen consequence of the regulation, namely the destruction of jobs. A friend of mine, a colleague, has written an important paper in labor economics that shows that a 10% increase in the minimum wage leads to a 25% decrease in jobs created within a year. Right? Now, that doesn't happen, every single year. It diminishes after that. But just think about that for a moment. A 10% hike in the price of labor is going to lead to a quarter fewer jobs in the future. But remember, that's jobs, that never existed, right? We didn't necessarily know they were going to exist. And so people are able to ignore the consequences of that regulation. And in fact, I think most people are ignorant of that effect, period. They don't put two and two together that raising the cost of labor means there's going to be a decrease in the demand for labor. That's why they should, of course, take their economics classes.
The other side of this, and by the way, Johnson & Wales, well known for its food services industry. It's a renowned company in the area of food services, but also you're teaching folks all sorts of Epicurean experiences there at Johnson & Wales. So you're teaching your students the economics, the structure for business, because they've got to be business people in the process, correct?
Oh, absolutely. The way to increase your wage, the way to increase your value as an input to any production, to a company, is to increase the scarcity of your service. Mm-hmm. Right, to make yourself sort of a rare breed. So like at Johnson & Wales, we do all kinds of things to help students out, things like cross-training, where they're training across multiple forms of production. Even if, let's say, they want to be a cook and a cook only, they're still going to learn things like front of house, more kind of customer relationships and that sort of thing, so that later on they can apply that in a wider variety of ways. And again, that's making them a rarer input, right? A more scarce input, and that's going to raise their market value.
And also, you said market value. It also makes them a more valuable employee to the company with whom they're working.
Well, right, exactly. I'm sorry, those are the same things.
Yeah.
I'm just getting into my my econ speak, but yeah, they're going to be more valuable to the company, and then compare that to a regulatory approach where we just kind of raise the bar for everyone. I mean, just because I make the minimum wage $15 doesn't mean every worker suddenly becomes worth $15.
Right.
So think about all of the people whose skills are just not worth $15 to the company. They don't get the job. You know, they're now out of work. There is not a job for them that once was available. But we don't see that. We don't see that effect. And so we don't realize that negative consequence in our thinking about, you know, what are the benefits and costs of this sort of regulation.
The other thing that worries me is that eventually, if we have established the federal government identifying the value of a job, the next thing we're going to see is the federal government saying it's a right of the individual to have a job. And then the next thing, of course, will be to have the job of their choice. So all of a sudden, we're regulated into not only what price we pay for the service, but the fact that folks automatically get access to those services.
Well, it'll be interesting to find out who's going to pay for all that.
Exactly. Well, the consumer eventually. Our guest, and I thank you for being with us this afternoon, Professor Adam Smith. He is, as I mentioned earlier, the Assistant Professor of Economics and the Director of the Center for Free Market Studies at Johnson & Wales University in Charlotte, North Carolina. Professor, as always, thank you very much for being with us. I think that this topic of minimum wage has got a lot of legs, and we'll be talking about this in the near term as well.
Pleasure being here. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Professor Adam Smith, you're listening to Viewpoints on the talk station FM 107 AM 1240.